In this pod, we'll take a closer look at Anglo-Saxon society.
Anglo-Saxon England was predominantly rural, with most of the population living in villages. Rural means that life was largely based in the countryside rather than in towns. Villages were very small and typically included around 12 farmers' dwellings as well as a church. Animals roamed across pastures and crops were grown in the surrounding fields.
Though some villages may have had a manor house filled with multiple rooms and private gardens, most could not afford such luxuries. Farmers' dwellings were very simple one-room houses. They were made from wattle and daub. This was a mixture of sticks, soil, dung and clay. A fire would be lit in the middle of the room for warmth and cooking. If it was particularly cold outside, any livestock and animals would be brought into the house.
Towns were very rare, as the Anglo-Saxons preferred to live in smaller villages. However, some old Roman towns were never completely abandoned as they were often surrounded by a wall. This was good for military strategy during war. For example, the old Roman town Londonburg was re-established in the late 9th century in the area that is now known as London.
A clear social hierarchy could be found across society. At the very top was the king, though in earlier stages of Anglo-Saxon rule, England was split into multiple kingdoms, each with their own ruler. The king was the most powerful and influential person in the kingdom. He was responsible for the administration of justice, defence and law. In return, his subjects were expected to show loyalty and to serve in the army as required.
The majority of the population were peasant farmers. They rented land from the local lord, which they then farmed for their own use. In return, they were obliged to work for the lord, often 3 to 4 days a week. Failure to manage the lord's fields would result in the loss of their land.
A small percentage of the population were free farmers, known as churls. Churls were not tied to a single lord and had the freedom to travel to other lands to work. Nonetheless, when they worked on a piece of land, they were still obligated to work for the lord who owned it.
Below farmers in the social hierarchy were slaves. They accounted for around 10% of the population and were seen legally as property rather than people. Landowners could buy and sell slaves. They were forced to work on the land and had no rights or freedoms.
Towards the top of the social hierarchy were the wealthy aristocrats, known as thanes and earls. These were rich men who directly served the king. They were expected to collect the king's taxes and to raise an army. Thanes made up less than 1% of the population. They were local lords who owned enough land to be self-sufficient. Often, they lived in large manor houses. Earls were higher ranking than them, and they were the closest to the king. They acted as his advisors in many different matters, particularly in warfare. There were very few earls at any one time, usually around 6. They were highly rewarded by the king and were expected to show complete loyalty and devotion in return.
Whilst there was a social hierarchy, it was flexible. All could be promoted or demoted depending on their wealth and if they had favour with the king. A slave could be set free by his master just as easily as a peasant farmer could become a slave.